Cooking appears necessary, not just for taste, but for safety. We're told it kills harmful bacteria, makes food easier to digest, even unlocks nutrients the body couldn't access otherwise. And beyond that, it's tradition. Every culture has a kind of speciality, every kitchen depends on it. Warm food feels right, is how we survived, especially in the north. Almost like food isn't food until it has been cooked. That's how many of us understand it. But what if the reason we cook isn't exactly the reason we think? Welcome to Look Again, the channel where we do not tell you what is true, but where we question what you accept and assume to be true. To be fair, the idea is everywhere. From childhood, we learn that raw food is incomplete, even unsafe. That cooking is what makes it not only edible, but kills all the harmful bacteria. If we don't eat cooked food, we'll get stomach ulcers. These and similar ideas are repeated so often that we simply never consider even questioning them. They are reinforced daily through habit, culture, through what we are seeing everybody else doing. So naturally, it feels like this is simply how we humans are meant to eat. But can something that becomes common also become natural? Let's slow down for a moment. If we were to remove everything that is required to cook, no recipes, no fire, no tools, what would actually count as food to you? Now imagine you haven't eaten all day, you're genuinely hungry, and different foods are placed in front of you. A ripe fruit, choose any one of your selection, handful of nuts, raw grains, raw potato, or a piece of a raw meat, still maybe covered in blood. Again, no tools, no fire, no preparation. Just the food as it is. Which one would you choose? Not what you desire to eat or what you think you want, but what is the food that you would choose? What doesn't need to be transformed before it becomes acceptable? Dr. Just, in his Return to Nature, points into this direction. Only the things that taste good to us in the raw natural condition can be considered our natural food. Now, if that's the case, then what we accept instantly without changes might be pointing to something we usually simply discard. And then, what does it mean when something only becomes acceptable after it has been changed? Because here where it becomes less clear. If cooking is said to make food usable and more enjoyable, what exactly does cooking do with the nutrients present in the food? If something needs to be transformed first, heated, softened, or otherwise altered, does that process create something new, or just make something more tolerable? Here is another line from Dr. Just and his book Return to Nature, which is really an incredible mind-opening piece of art. He's saying, by artificial preparation, the most unnatural things can be made to taste good. And if the changed food is now edible, where previously it was repulsive, does that process actually add something valuable to the food, or just change how it's experienced? And when our senses rebel against eating something, does it mean that cooking can alter our senses, or just the way we get past them? Maybe the question isn't whether cooking helps, but what role it actually plays. Does it improve what is already suitable? Or does it allow us to consume things that otherwise wouldn't be acceptable at all? As usual, there are few layers that are important to discuss, and like with any of these topics, there are many, and we have picked 4 today. So the layer number 1 is the bacteria in the food. Now, like we mentioned before, cooking is told or is said to destroy all the harmful bacteria, thereby making the food safer. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. But in that same process, everything else that was alive in that food is affected. So there are harmful bacteria, let's say, but there are also good bacteria. And we know that our digestion depends on bacteria. So if we kill bad bacteria, we kill also the good bacteria. So there's something, cooking doesn't choose, right? So through the whole process, everything that was alive is affected. The raw food that we call raw food isn't just a matter with nutrients. Contains enzymes and ferments, which is not abstract chemistry, but they are active agents involved in transformation and breakdown of that material within our body. In simple terms, they are as part of the food's own living activity, helping it sift, soften, and break down, which is a process that continues inside of the body. Dr. Henry Tilden, in his book Impaired Health, stated that cooking interrupts this process entirely, because he's saying if food is cooked, the enzymes and germs are all killed. And what does that actually imply? It is not just about removing harmful bacteria, it's about removing all of them that exist in the food at the moment it enters the body. So digestion, instead of being a shared process between the body and what the food already contains, becomes something that the body must carry out entirely on its own. And so, if the part of the digestive process was once supported by what the food naturally contained, what changes when that support is no longer there at all? Does the system simply continue the same way? Or does the entire process shift into something more demanding without it? The layer number 2, overeating. There is something else that appears alongside cooked food. I mean, it's kind of obvious, and it's the capacity to eat more. Cooked food is easier to swallow, is less resistance, less effort. And because of that, the natural stopping point becomes less distinct. Dr. Graham, in the History of Natural Hygiene, suggested that the cooked food will enable an individual to swallow excessive quantities, but not necessarily because the body needs more, and not necessarily because it is preparing for some kind of shortage in the future, but because the boundary of sufficiency becomes less noticeable. And yet there is always a limit, a point where additional intake is no longer neutral, where it stops contributing meaningfully and begins to shift into strain. So the question is not just how much is eaten, but how that limit becomes harder to recognize in the first place. And when that boundary is no longer clear, what begins to guide the continuation instead? The layer number 3 is adaptation versus suitability. Every food or every living creature in this planet has a certain food that has been designed to eat. And if a species consumes something that requires continuous modification, what does that say about the relationship between the organism and the food itself? It is something the body naturally moves towards too, or something it adapts over time? Because adaptation and suitability are not the same thing. One leads to ease, the other to adjustment. and these don't always point to the same direction. And the question becomes, does the organism thrive on this pattern where it has to always adjust, or does it simply maintain itself within it? Does it thrive, or does it, like we said, only adjust? A state of functioning or a state of continuous compensation? And if something requires constant external intervention, fire, tools, processing, does it reflect alignment with nature or a movement away from it? Will any species achieve their full, perfect development if it subsists on food that is not natural to it? Or are there some penalties that are inherent with sustaining on different kinds of food that is not suitable? And then there is layer 4, dependency, convenience, and perceived necessity. Maybe not immediately visible in the act of eating itself, but present in how eating becomes organized over time. Because once food is consistently prepared, transformed, made ready by external means, a certain dependency begins to form around that process. Not as something dramatic, but as something practical. Convenience starts to define what is considered necessary. If something is easier to access in a changed form, that version gradually becomes the standard. And when what was once optional preparation starts to feel like the condition itself, the question then is not about food anymore, but about what happens when the process around the food becomes part of what we assume is required. At what point does convenience then stop being a tool and starts becoming the baseline through which necessity is defined? And if that baseline keeps shifting over time, what exactly are we measuring necessity against in the first place? So this might not be only about cooking. It might be about how something starts to feel natural simply because it is commonly done. Because when a behavior is repeated across generations and shared by most people around us, it slowly stops appearing as something that was only chosen and starts appearing as something obvious. And in that shift, familiarity begins to replace what is natural. What is common starts to feel correct. What is repeated starts to feel necessary. What is widely accepted starts to feel self-evident. Not because it has been examined, but because it is all around us. And at that point, the question is no longer whether something is natural or artificial, but whether repetition alone can convert something artificial into something natural. So when something becomes widely accepted, does it also become more aligned with nature, or simply more familiar or convenient to us? And if familiarity is what we use as a reference point, how often do we pause to ask whether that reference point was ever examined in the first place? Because something can be common without being natural, and something can be shared by everyone without being correct. So the question is not what most people do, but how often do we assume that what most people do must therefore automatically be what is right?